I may not know the result of the referendum if Britain will remain in the Union, but I'm sure of one result, that is that it will not reunite the Tory party. That is for clear. Because what I'm seeing is a glorified cockfight since Mr. Tusk had reached this deal. Boris Johnson challenging David Cameron. I can tell you, I have seen an ambitious politician. I myself an ambitious politician. But Boris Johnson takes it to a whole other level. A whole other level, because it's real the Mayor of London acting against the interests of the citizens of London. And that all for personal ambition, and certainly not for a better Europe and for a better Britain. It's totally bonkers, dear colleagues. And it's pathetic, I should say, that it is happening. It's even dramatic for Britain, especially Mr. Fox. The pound, what we see, is rapidly falling. The unity of the United Kingdom is under threat. And their American cousins are saying, please stop it, we will not make a trade deal with you outside the Union. Apparently the special relationship between the US and the UK is apparently not so special anymore today. So let me give an advice to those who are doing this now, this debate in Britain. Don't think that after a no, you can come back to the negotiation table. I know that some people are thinking that, saying, it's Europe. Once you have said no in a referendum, you're invited back to the negotiation table, like with Ireland, like with Denmark, like after the constitution with France and the Netherlands. But it's not about the same thing. That was about the constitution, that was about a treaty. Here it's about in or out. It's the one or the other. And if I see how the currency of Britain is endangered, how now Britain is alienated from the US, and how Britain is step by step transformed in Little England, I think they're going to be wise and to stay in the European Union. But, dear colleagues, as pathetic this debate is for the UK, it's also a dramatic debate and an important debate for Europe. Because let's be honest, what we are discussing now is crazy. What we have to unite. We have not to be divided. The only ones who gain from a divided Europe are whom? People like Vladimir Putin, people like Bashar al-Assad, IS. I have nothing, Mr. Fox, against giving a special status to Britain. If next time you agree also that in the next treaty revision we can also go ahead in our integration. In all these reforms, we are needed to establish a more united Europe. Thank you.
Are you aware of the fact that also people from your group, even Finns, campaign for the Brexit?
I cannot see the interest of a Finn campaigning for a Brexit. I like it more interesting that it is the British people who are deciding and that the British politicians are taking position. And I can tell you one thing, if there is one party in the UK who is going to fight that Britain remain in the Union, it's going to be the Liberal Democratic movement, and them alone.
I'd like to thank the EU leaders for their tolerance for yet more British demands. They recognise the importance of a deal for Mr Cameron, but mostly for his own party. Now the battle begins. The referendum is underway, but it is not yet safely won. We've been fed lies and scare stories over 20 years from a largely foreign-owned media and comical characters such as Mr Farage. The stakes could not be higher. People I speak to want to know their future will be prosperous, stable and secure. Staying in Europe is the best way to guarantee that. Businesses know access to the world's largest single market far outweighs any free trade deals. But the work of the EU is so much more. It's migration, climate change, terrorists, all these. We must work together on these issues. Those calling for EU exit are like lemmings running to the cliff's edge, but they can't tell us what is on the other side. That's not patriotic, it's idiotic. Let's remain in together with a Britain to be proud to hand on to our future generations. Thank you.
Mr. Farage.
Really rather exciting, isn't it? It's referendum season, and the referendum is coming on the 6th of April in the Netherlands, where they're going to have a referendum on the Ukrainian deal, and the opinion polls show they are going to reject it. And just today, Mr. Orban has announced there is going to be a referendum in Hungary, where they're going to have a referendum on whether they should be forced to accept mandatory quotas for migrants after the grievous errors of the EU's common asylum policy, not to mention Mrs. Merkel's pronouncements. And overnight we get a Czech Premier telling us that there is now demand building in the Czech Republic to have a referendum on membership. Oh, and I nearly forgot, there's going to be a British referendum on June the 23rd on whether we remain or leave the European Union. And this follows a 40-hour summit where Mr. Cameron, doing his modern-day impression of Oliver Twist, went up to Mr. Tusk and said, "Please, sir, can I have some more concessions?" Well, he didn't get very much, did he? We're allowed to change ever so slightly migrant benefits for a short period of time, and we're told that in future we won't be committed to ever closer union. And on the basis of all of that, we're going to have a referendum that the Prime Minister says on a deal that is legally binding. And indeed, Mr. Tusk joined in with this today by saying the British deal was legally binding. To top that off, Mr. Cameron has told us that he will lodge the deal, he will lodge the documents at the United Nations. But frankly, you might as well lodge an old pair of socks, because it's completely meaningless. The fact that you lodge a document there, you could use a safety deposit box. But is this deal legally binding, Mr. Tusk? Well, the ECJ themselves said in 2008 that the obligations imposed by an international agreement cannot have the effect of prejudicing the constitutional principles of the EU treaties, which means the ECJ rule in favour of the existing treaties until we get a new treaty. But who's to say there's going to be a new treaty? Any new treaty would trigger yet more referendums and would not be favoured, I think, by the big groups in this Parliament. But of course we have an emergency brake. That's being judged to be a great success. But, crucially, that happens through secondary legislation that can be voted on by this Parliament. So what happens? We have a referendum, we follow Mr. Cameron, we vote to remain, and then we come back to this Parliament. Is this Parliament going to support British exceptionalism? And I think we've heard voices today that make it perfectly clear that that will not happen. So the deal, Mr. Tusk and Mr. Cameron, if you're listening, is not legally binding in any way at all. And I have to say the British public will decide which is our safest option. Is it safe to stay within an organisation whose own police boss tells us there are 3,000 to 5,000 terrorists that have now come into our continent through the migrant crisis, or is it safest to take back control of our own borders and our own democracy? After much consideration, I have decided to opt to vote for us to leave.
Mr. Farage, there is a question from Mr. Casa.
Well, we all know that Mr. Farage has been working for Britain to leave since I joined here in Parliament 11 years ago. He has tried local elections in the United Kingdom, but he didn't have any success, did he? Then he went for the general elections in the United Kingdom, hardly a success there. On the contrary, he secured a bigger majority for David Cameron and the Conservative Party. Now, if in the referendum, which he always wanted, the majority of the British people say yes, meaning to stay part of us in the European Union, will he call it a day and retire from politics? Or would he want another chance to stay here, enjoying the company of us Europeans?
Well, Mr. Casa, I don't know who's been briefing you on UKIP's electoral history. You perhaps haven't got a very good memory, I'm not sure. But in 2014, with 28% of the vote, UKIP won the European elections, topping the poll across the United Kingdom, the first time since 1906 that a party that wasn't Labour or the Conservatives had won a national election. So I hope that brings you up to speed. As for the referendum, yeah, I believe it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm certain that if we vote to remain, we're unlikely ever to get another opportunity, and we will sink deeper inside this political union. But I think there's every chance now that the momentum is on our side of the argument, and so yes, we're going to vote to leave, and within a short period of time, all the British MEPs will be gone. How about that?
Mrs. Dodds, please.
As we in the United Kingdom look towards our very own Independence Day on the 23rd of June, we do so knowing that despite the best efforts of our Prime Minister to deliver change, the EU is neither willing nor able to do so. The new settlement promised to us in 2013 by David Cameron has been ditched. Our sovereignty will continue to be eroded and our security will continue to be at risk. We will continue to send billions more to the EU than we get back, and the fundamental flaws of membership will remain. But, Mr. President, even if we look at the mediocre tweaks being hailed by those advocating remain, they bring with them no guarantees. There will be no guarantee of treaty change. This Parliament can unravel the deal, as can the ECJ. What we have before us is a charade, an attempt to deceive the British people with a pig-in-the-poke deal. My message to my constituents is, don't buy it. Believe in our United Kingdom, because in the words of that wonderful Belfast-born author, there are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind.
Thank you. For the ENF group now, Madame Le Pen. Honourable members, 4 months' time the UK will vote, the Britons will vote in or out. And Brexit is for the UK an opportunity to look back and measure the benefits of joining up way back in '76. If they decide that it's wanting, they can opt for freedom, for sovereignty. And if they do that, they'll find the ways of solving the problems of the modern world. Now, if you think back to Article 28 of the Charter of Human Rights, a generation cannot subjugate to its laws future generations. A generation of the British decided to join the European Union. That generation can now not impose on European institutions cannot impose our institutions to future generations, and that's a lesson of democracy, and it has full legitimacy. European Union imposes innumerable rules and treaties on successive generations, but decisions, those are taken by unelected people, usually without proper democratic debate and without it having even been had out in the media. That's the opposite of those who are ruled. And this is a kind of tyranny, arriving legally in power, but then making an illegal and violent use of it. A travesty of an agreement is not going to change that cruel reality any more than threats or blackmail, which are proliferating on the margins of the system, nor the polls taken by Mr. Soros, used by Mr. Weber, who clearly prefers polls to referenda. You cannot refuse to be judged by the people and, if necessary, sanctioned and penalised punished by them, because that's the very essence of the quintessence of democracy. And I believe that the punishment for you will be brutal, because the recompense for the British people will be freedom.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Atkinson, 1 minute.
First of all, I'd like to thank, we've got some constituents in from the South East, and welcome. I hope you've enjoyed the debate. Well, that was a successful negotiation. David Cameron got precisely 1% of what he asked for, and only if there's treaty change. I represented the ENF in the Conference of Presidents last week, along with Mr Brok. Our arrogant Prime Minister decided he only wanted to meet half the MEPs and the EU leaders represented there, despite us actually representing hundreds of MEPs. That meeting told me what the British people need to know. There will be no treaty change, there will be no taking back control of our borders, there will be no restriction on the free movement of people, the so-called in-work benefits break could be challenged by the EU courts, and the only vote on the deal by the MEPs in this chamber is only indicative and not legally binding. So, Mr Brok, the Prime Minister's deal is not worth the paper it's written on, and that was told to him by his Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, today. The EU courts and the EU politicians can rip it up straight after the referendum, and the only way to get real change is to vote leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Korwin-Mikke, 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Donald Tusk said that he cares about the free flow of people in Europe, but he forgot that the United Kingdom is not part of Schengen. Well, Ireland did provide help for Charles Marx even, but did not pay him benefits. We do need a common economy, but we don't need a band of officials who will be debating about the gorillas in Congo. If the British heard these debates, 90% of them would be voting for Brexit, which is why I hope that the United Kingdom leave the European Union and come back to the European Association of Free Trade, followed then by Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic and other countries. And on top of it, I believe that the EU must be destroyed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Korwin-Mikke, would you accept a blue card from Mr. Bonanno?
Sì, ho sentito
Thank you. I heard the intervention by our colleague, and can I ask, if there was a magic wand and you were in the position of Mr. Juncker or Mr. Tusk, what would you do immediately? What would be the first thing you would do with your magic wand?
I would announce the end of the European Union, if I could.
Fortunately, we live in a real world. Now, Mr. de Graaff, 1 minute.
President, the opinion polls tell us that a majority of the British population want the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. The European Union is clearly disregarding the will of the people and democracy. Everything is being done in order to avoid that happening, and that's why we get this settlement, this agreement. The UK gets not a millimetre of sovereignty back. And it's clear who's running, who's being operated by the strings coming from the European Commission. Surely countries should be able to be boss in their own country. This is an historic chance for the UK. The Netherlands, 53% want an exit. And that should also be called, so that the EU can be cooperating sovereign countries with more freedom and more prosperity and welfare. Thank you.
President of the Council, Commissioner, I'd like to thank Presidents Tusk and Juncker for the good cooperation with the European Parliament during the summit that they offered and delivered. I think Europe's interests were not on sale in the negotiations, but the UK got what it needed for a successful referendum. We committed ourselves to comply with rules of independent legislation, but committed ourselves politically to try and bring this political project to a successful conclusion. And I think that's important, and the atmosphere of the negotiations bore that out. It's my view that this deal is one that is legally tenable, and we need to put in legislation that will stand the course. On that basis, we can achieve what David Cameron said at the end of the negotiations: the UK, too, in a changing world, has no opportunity for influence other than in conjunction with Europe, fighting terrorism and more besides. If you look that without us, the US and the Russians are arriving at a deal, that should bring it home that national states cannot achieve things alone. We either achieve things together or not at all. And I think that is a way of winning solidarity back for our citizens through Europe. And I think that this deal will be recognised by the British people who have to decide on it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I always like to cite from my favourite television programme, Yes, Prime Minister. In particular, the episode where Sir Humphrey says, "Minister, Britain has had the same foreign policy objective for at least the last 500 years, to create a disunited Europe. In that cause, we have fought with the Dutch against the Spanish, with the Germans against the French, with the French and Italians against the Germans, and with the French against the Germans and the Italians. Divide and rule, you see. Why should we change now, when it's worked so well?" Well, as a Dutch liberal and as a European, I would say, let's prove Sir Humphrey wrong on June the 23rd. Dear British friends, we want you in. We need you in. And not because of some vague deal, but because only with a strong, united Europe we can respond to the challenges of the 21st century. Refugees, terrorism, climate change, the energy crisis, and only together we can make the lives of our citizens better by seizing the fantastic opportunities of the internet era and the global economy. Let's build our future together, friends. Vote in on June 23rd. Thank you.
Thank you very much.